Chapter 8 of Law in General. In the researches hitherto made concerning the rule of human action, we have consulted only the nature of man, his essence, and what belongs to his internal part. The inquiry has shown us that man finds within himself and in his own reason the rule he ought to follow, and since the counsels which reason gives him point out shortest and safest road to his perfection and happiness, from thence arises a principle of obligation or a cogent motive to square his actions by this primitive rule. But in order to have an exact knowledge of the human system, we must not stop at these first considerations. We should likewise, pursuant to the method already pointed out in this work, transfer our attention to the different states of man and to the relations from thence arising, which must absolutely produce some particular modifications in the rules he is to follow. For, as we have already observed, these rules ought not only to be conformable to the nature of man, but they should be proportional, moreover, to his state and situation. Hang on just a second. Righty. Well, I know I'm tripping. Oh no, my glasses are at y'all. My balls are struggling. Now, among the primitive states of man, dependence is one of those which merits the most attention and ought to have the greatest influence on the rule he is to observe. In fact, a being independent of everybody else has no other rule to pursue but the counsels of his own reason, and in consequence to this independence he is free from all subjugation to another's will. In short, he is absolute master of himself and his actions. But the case is not the same with a being who is supposed to be dependent on another, and as on his superior and master. The sense of this dependence ought naturally to engage the inferior to take the will of him on whom he depends. The sense of this dependence ought naturally to engage the inferior to take the will of him on whom he depends for the rule of his conduct, since the subjection in which he finds himself does not permit him to entertain the least reasonable hopes of acquiring any solid happiness independent of the will of his superior, and of the views he may propose in relation to him. Besides, this has more or less extent and effect in proportion as the superiority of the one and the dependence of the other, and greater or less, absolute or limited. 'Tis obvious that all these remarks in a particular manner applicable to him, so that as soon as he acknowledges a superior to whom power and authority is naturally subject, in consequence of this state, he must acknowledge likewise the will of his superior to be the rule of his actions. This is the right we call law. 'Tis to be understood, however, that this will of superior has nothing in it contrary to reason, the primitive rule of man. For where this is the case, it would be impossible for us to obey him. In order to render a law the rule of human actions, it should be absolutely agreeable to the nature and constitution of man, and be ultimately designed for his happiness, which reason makes him necessarily pursue. These remarks though clear enough of themselves, will receive a greater light when we have more particularly explained the nature of law. Definition of law. Law, I define a rule prescribed by the sovereign of a society to his subjects, either in order to lay an obligation upon them of doing or omitting certain things under the under the combination of punishment, or to leave them at liberty to act or not in other things just as they think proper, and to secure to them in this respect the full enjoyment of their rights. By thus defining law, we deviate a little from the definitions given by Gordius and Puffendorf, but the definitions of these authors are, methinks, somewhat too vague, and besides, do not seem to agree with law considered in its full extent. This opinion of mine will be justified by the particular explication I am going to enter upon, provided it be compared with the passages here referred to. Why law was defined as a rule prescribed. I say that law is a rule to signify, in the first place, what law has in common with counsel, which is that they are both rules of conduct, and secondly, to distinguish law from the transient orders which may be given by superior, and not being permanent rules of the subject's conduct, are not properly laws. The idea of rule includes principally these two things: universality or perpetuity, and both these characters, being essential to rule, generally considered, help to discriminate law from any other particular will of the sovereign. I add that law is a rule prescribed, because a simple resolution confined within the sovereign's mind, without manifesting itself by some external sign, can never be law. 'Tis requisite that this will be notified in a proper manner to the subjects, so that they be acquainted with what the sovereign requires of them, and with the necessity of squaring thereby their conduct. But in what manner this notification is to be made, whether viva voce, VIVAVOCE, by writing or otherwise, is a matter of mere indifference. Sufficient it is that the subjects be properly instructed concerning the will of the litigator. Let us sense the explication of the principal ideas that enter into the definition of law. Law is prescribed by the sovereign. This is what distinguishes it from counsel, which comes from a friend or equal, who as such has no power over us, and whose advices consequently neither have the same force nor prudence, nor produce the same obligation as law, which, coming from a sovereign, has for its support the command and authority of a superior. Counsels are followed for reasons drawn from the nature of a thing. Laws are obeyed not only on account of the reasons on which they are established, but likewise because of the authority of the sovereign. The authority of the sovereign that prescribes them. The obligation arising from counsel is merely internal. That of law is both internal and external. Society, as we have already observed, is the union of several persons for a particular end, from whence some common advantage arises. The end is the effect or advantage which intelligent beings propose to themselves and are willing to procure. The union of several persons is the concurrence of their will to procure the end they aim at in common. But though we make the idea of society enter into the definition of law, it must not be inferred from thence that society is a condition absolutely essential and necessary to the enacting of laws. Considering the thing exactly, we may very well form a conception of law when the sovereign has only a single person subject to his authority, and 'tis only in order to enter into the actual state of things that we suppose a sovereign commanding a society of men. We must nevertheless observe that the relation there is between the sovereign and subject forms a society between them, but of a particular kind, which we may call society of inequality, where the sovereign commands and the subject obeys. The sovereign is therefore he who has a right to command the last retort, resort. To command is directing the actions of those who are subjects to us, according to our own will and with authority or the power of constraint. I say that the sovereign commands it in last resort, to show that as he has the first rank in society, his will is superior to any other and holds the members of society in subjection, and find the right of commanding it as nothing more than the power of directing the actions of others with authority, and as the power exercising one's force and liberty is no farther a right than as it is approved and authorized by reason. 'Tis on this approbation of reason that the last resort, that the right of commanding is established. This leads us to inquire more particularly into the natural foundation of empire or sovereignty, or, which amounts to the same thing, what is what is it that confers or constitutes a right of laying an obligation on another person and of requiring its submission and obedience? This is a very important question in itself, important also in its effects, for the more we are convinced of the reasons which establish on the one hand authority and dependence on the other hand, the more we are inclined to make a real and voluntary submission to those whom we depend. Besides, the diversity of sentiments in relation to the manner of laying the foundation of sovereignty is a sufficient proof that this subject requires to be treated with care and attention.